Namaste and welcome to Super Saturday, the 5th Fireside Conversation of Sustainable Narratives Conference. I can't believe that we're already halfway through our schedule, so please make sure that you sign up for some of the remaining events happening today and tomorrow. My name is Nicola Brown, and today I'm delighted to be moving from audience participant to my first chairing role of a VM event. Having attended a number of these events over the years, I've always found them to be highly engaging, thought-provoking and inspiring, and that is the point. We're here to discuss topics that are sometimes difficult and challenging and which will often leave us with more questions than answers. Our ability to question those narratives we live amongst is central to our discussion today. The discourse around Islam is polarizing. And I would suggest that in the West, we have a developing culture that discourages any criticism of Islam through a paralyzing fear of being accused of stirring up hatred on the basis of religion. And this has stifled earnest debate. So today we're going to explore many of the prevailing themes around Islam, but through a very personal lens. So let me welcome Drishti, President of the National Hindu Students Forum. It's great to have you here, Drishti.
Thank you for having me.
And what a life journey. We will discuss your role in the NHSF a little later on, so if you don't mind, I would really like to dive straight into our topic. I can't wait. So Drishti, why don't we start at the beginning? I'm interested to hear about your childhood and what it was like growing up in a British Muslim family.
Sure thing. Thank you, Nicola. So I guess I should probably caveat this discussion with a bit of an introduction of what type of family I grew up in. So I grew up in a household, I grew up in Shia Ithna Ashari Islam. So that's a minority sect of Islam. And so in the world, 90% roughly is around Sunni Islam and about 10% is about Shia Islam, just to set some context. And if we consider the spectrum of families and family life that you get, I would position myself as, or my upbringing is very typical. So I wasn't born into a very strict, militant, or extremely conservative family, but I wasn't even in the extra super liberal camp either. I was somewhere around the middle. So I just wanted to set that framework. So with that, to answer your question, what was it like growing up in Islam? I'd probably call out two ideas or two central principles. And that is one, that my upbringing and my childhood was largely governed by fear. And the second is a word that I'd like to put out there, which is limited. And I'll come back to that. I'll just like to expand on those if I may. So governed by fear, what do I mean by that? So from about the age of about 5, you would be introduced to a regular form of class known as madrassa. And they would either be held at the mosque, the masjid, or they'd be held at a private center. So I started at my local mosque at the age of 5. And one of the earliest lessons, in fact, most of our lessons at that age revolve around the concept of hell. Now, hell is a terrible, terrible place. It's not something that is abstract. It's not mythical. It's not an idea out there. It's very real. And it's something that every human being, every living thing will encounter in their lives. And it's described to young children at the age of 4 or 5 with excruciating detail. So female, went to madrasa and had lessons particular for my gender. And so there you're introduced to the notion of hijab, you're introduced to the notion of right and wrong as dictated by Sharia law, as what's in the Quran, and what is mandated by Allah. And you're given really colorful examples of not believing or of misbehaving. So I'll give you an example of that. So the punishment for not wearing the hijab is for every single day that you do not wear the hijab, to be held by your hair, not by anything else, but you're held by your hair above a raging fire. And, the teachers there, who are just ordinary mums at this age, at this part of my life, who would describe it in excruciating detail, this raging fire that you're held above until every single hair in your head is pulled out for you to then be burnt to a crisp until you are nothing but ash, to be regenerated again by the might of Allah, to endure that punishment over and over again until you've paid for your sin of going out uncovered. Now that story I remember from around 5 years old. And so it's quite powerful. It, injects fear into your psyche straight. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by governed by fear. And I'm sure we'll explore that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. The second idea, or the second thing that I pointed to, was being limited. And that is with respect to the limitations upon each individual, I found, on your ability to question. So a central idea, as I knew it, is the notion of doubt, known as shak. Mm-hmm. You are allowed to ask questions, as I did as a young child, but only if it will strengthen your faith. If you start showing signs of doubt, of not believing the central tenets of Islam, doubting the 5 pillars, doubting the omnipotence of Allah, there is something to be said about that. There are structures in place to let your parents know, so on and so forth, and that is definitely something I ran into time and time again. So, governed by fear and limited, I guess, are the 2 things that I found quite apparent.
So I'm guessing that really, in terms of the differences, the experiences that you're explaining there, but the differences between boys and girls, I'm really interested in that, because I'm guessing particularly, as we're teenagers, those years are so important in terms of our development, our sense of self, our character. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So I think I've just started to point to it, and that is, I pointed to the hijab.
The hijab, yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's something that, all of us can relate to, because it's something physical that we see. Mm-hmm. The differences do run further, more deeper than what we do see. So I'm going to start with the concept of maturity. So according to Islam, girls mature at the age of 9, or when they start their period, or when their parents deem that a girl is mature enough. At the very latest, it will be at the age of 9 years. And that's not 9 years according to the Gregorian calendar, that's 9 years according to the Islamic calendar, which is just around 8.5 years old. Mm-hmm. What does this concept of maturity mean? Well, when a girl is considered mature in Islam, it means that she is eligible to get married. She is a woman. And this is something that, you do visit in a madrasa when you're talking about women in Islam. You hear girls being married at the ages of 6, 7, because they were classed as mature then by their family. And that is a mark of pride. So there's a cultural or an attitude that exists. So if your daughter hits maturity before the age of 9, it's like, wow, doesn't she come from a really good household? Mm-hmm. It's important, because maturity is when, according to Islam, that you are accountable for your own actions. So up until around 8.5, if you do something wrong, if you do something that is classed as haram, you're forgiven, because you're innocent, you're pure, and you don't know any better. Mm-hmm. If you hit 9, that responsibility, that level of accountability is upon your shoulders. And that's where I think the gravity of the hijab sets in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hijab on at the age of 9, you are now a woman. You are now accountable for your actions. Effectively, playtime is over. And when we, look at the mirror image for men or for boys, they're classed as mature at the age of 15, not 9, not 10, but 15. Mm-hmm. And I think now you can say, okay, girls do mature sooner than boys, and you can start to accept that, and you might see that as wise, as it's often touted within the mosque. But at the age of 9, when prayers are mandatory, fasting is mandatory, and covering your arms up until your wrist, making sure your feet can't be seen, not a hair is visible, you're covered up to your chin, you do feel like it's really, really unfair. Why is there this difference between boys and girls? It's like a central question for every young girl, at least in my experience.
Can I just ask you, one thing that really interested me is this concept of flourishing as a human being, and what that means for a woman. And I think what we need in our society to enable that to happen. And I wonder, now that we're sort of talking about growing up as a, as a young girl into a woman. And can you touch on that from an Islamic perspective, as you were growing up?
Sure. So I think this continues on this thread quite nicely. So as a young girl, you put on the hijab. At the age of 9, you're mature, you're a woman, you're allowed to get married. It also means that, so sex is seen as a sin. Sex outside of marriage is sin. But the burden of accountability is thrust upon the woman. You must be covered. To answer your previous question about psychological effect, you do grow up feeling unseen to a large extent, because your male relatives that are not your immediate brothers, that are not your father or your immediate uncles, are now able and allowed to marry you. So they're known as non-mahram. So anyone not within those categories is a potential husband. And so your interactions with them cease. And so your role as a good Muslim woman at that age then is to respect that boundary. It's to not raise your voice. It's to follow the word of Allah, the word of the Quran, and also to bring others to Islam. So, it's very, very important that you do have children. It's very, very important that you do bring them up in as good Muslims. And that's an effect that I can see my mother did feel. So it was not uncommon to grow up hearing, you don't love me, that's why you misbehave. And the reason why that sentence won't be so uncommon to young Muslims is because a parent's entry into heaven is directly tied to how good a Muslim their child is. So for a woman who is charged with the akhlaq and so that means the good manners and the behavior of her children, but also their adherence to Islam, it is so important that she has good Muslims as children. Now, I didn't necessarily do that for my mother, asking a lot of questions as I did. And so, whether she was pressured, whether she felt, internally a sense of insecurity, I don't know. But at the age of 11, she deemed it the right thing to do to send me off to Iran for a whole month because I wasn't following that structure of a good Muslim with the questions that I was posing.
Okay, so that sort of brings me on to, I just want to touch on sort of mental health and well-being, because I think there are real concerns in society today, and more young people than ever before are reporting poor mental health. Do you think this is a particular issue then for young Muslims? And I wonder how the experiences that you've experienced have affected and shaped your sense of self.
Yeah. So in, again, coming back to hijab, and I keep coming back to this because in formative years, it is such a big theme for young women, young girls, right? From being able to be free, to play, to explore the world, to suddenly, having to shrink back to corners sometimes, having a lot of your behavior policed, not just by your parents, but by your community, starts to affect you. But also you're unable to express or even explore your own sexuality. You're unable to express who you feel you are or who you want to be, because there is a certain right that you must follow. And so a powerful anecdote that's given in madrassas, in mosques, even in sermons and in khutbahs, is a woman is like a pearl in a shell. She is so beautiful, but she should not be touched by anything, everything. She should be only for that person who is, who's going to look after her. And that in Islam is her husband. So she should be in her hijab at all times so that, wandering eyes are not attracted to her. That's kind of like the rhetoric that's given. And so for a young girl, this can have many consequences, but one that I found quite common amongst my friends, and even for myself, to an extent, was that you end up thinking you're the best thing since sliced bread. You feel unseen, you feel restricted, but you think when people really see me, they'll really see me, they'll be able to see my beauty. They'll be able to see me without the hijab, or they'll be able to see different facets of my personality that right now I have to hide, or right now that I must keep. And so that can really distort or warp your sense of self, because there are certain facets that you want to explore. Even when you get to school, when you get to college, you must remain segregated. That burden is upon you. you're pulled out of swimming lessons because you're exposing the shape of your body, and that's not okay because you are a woman, not a girl. So many different consequences start kicking in that exploration is limited, but then your sense of self does start to get distorted or warped, in my view.
Okay. I wonder if now we can just move on a little bit, because I think what I'm quite interested now is just to look at, I guess, the organisation of Islam. And I think Islam is very effective at organising a society. And where this is based on your religion and you play by the rules, it can be a strong unifying force in many ways. I can remember from my own experiences, and I know we were sort of talking about this before, over the sort of looking back over the last 30 years, that there was many more cultural manifestations of Islam many years ago, all around the world. And I think this is definitely less today. And we've talked about that sort of anti-culturalist idea. Do you think that that is true? And can you also explain how the hierarchy works in Islam?
Sure. So I think there's a few things in that question to unpack. So I'll do my best to, I think, unpack the question and guide me if I get it wrong.
Yeah.
So yes, being part of the Muslim community gives one an extraordinary sense of belonging, right? Belonging is there all over the world because you've got a unified community, the Ummah. It's also extraordinarily structured. You can look up a book called A Code of Practice for Muslims in the West, and it will dictate absolutely everything for you. Any question that you can ask, you will have answered. Because in Shia Islam in particular, there is this concept of a merja, someone that you would swear allegiance to at the point of maturity that will help interpret the law for you wherever the word of God in the Quran is not clear enough for humanity today. So kind of like a pope-like figure, I guess, in simple speak, but that exists. And so in this book and in similar books, you will have things explained to you like what foot to use when you enter somebody's house, what hand to eat with, what foot to use when you enter the bathroom, what rituals you need to perform after there's been a total eclipse or a solar eclipse. Everything is explained in explicit detail, and that is then codified for you to follow. So structure is extraordinary. It does, give a reprieve for those that are looking for it in thinking about lots of things. If a fatwa is issued, if a new direction is issued, you will follow it because you surrender yourself. And Islam, means that. It means to surrender. So that's a very powerful notion. And, going back in history, Islam was used or was created to emancipate those that were slaves. So, thousands of years ago, it was a very powerful movement. It allowed, it enabled the ability for the community to organize and for Muslims to unite. We still see the effects of that today. But the attitude within the Ummah, and I guess there are certain ideas that we can explore here, if I may, Nicola, that do shape this, right? So if you want to buy into this extraordinary sense of belonging, this extraordinary structure, and this, beautiful way to organize, you also have to take in part and parcel of that, the dogma, the self-policing or the policing and the governing of the community. And that is because as it is your parents' duty to ensure that you grow up as a good Muslim, so their sign of being a good Muslim and their entry into heaven is directly tied to the performance or the piety of their children, so too, there are powerful ideas that exist within the community that will also ensure that every young Muslim will feel the need to help one another. So if you see a young person asking too many questions, it is the right thing for you to do to call their parent up or to tell your parent or to tell a senior within the mosque, I think there's something wrong here. I think, shaitan, the devil, is speaking to them because they're asking the wrong type of questions. Or, you see a young woman, walking out alone after a certain hour. It is absolutely okay for you to do the same action and say, I don't think there's something right. Well, God forbid, you're walking down the road with a young boy, as I did when I was younger, and, there is a physical and a psychological consequence that is quite unsightly that will ensue. So that's kind of like the basis within which, I guess, the community looks to regulate itself. You pointed to a hierarchy, I think, right? So one powerful idea that really takes this forward, what we've just explained, is this idea that I grew up with, which is when there are 200 true Muslims in the world, so real devout Muslims, then the Imam that is in hiding, so a descendant of the Prophet, the 12th Imam, who is in hiding and has been in hiding for about 1,000 years, will come to lead us again, will come to lead us towards Judgment Day, which is again another central theme. But the consequence of that narrative is that there are not even 200 true Muslims in the world. And so that pressure that you feel as a young person when you look at culture, which I think was your question, is that variation is not good. That variation is taking us away from the true word of Islam as is in the Quran. There has been no other book, there has been no other prophet. So this is the truest word, and this is what we adhere to. Science must conform to what's in the Quran. Progress must conform to what is in the Quran. And so those are very, very powerful memes that I think, look to persist.
It's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. I think one of the stories that I remember that you shared with me, one of the anecdotes some time ago, was around the idea of impurity. And you shared this story about a Hindu friend that came to your house when you were young. Could you sort of share that with the audience? Because I think that was something that really was quite poignant to me, that particular story, because particularly when you were so young when that happened.
Absolutely. So I think there's two parts to this. So I think there's the anecdote, which I will, the story that I will share. And then I also want to share a little bit about where that comes from. So I'll probably do it in that order. So really well remembered. So I was 7 years old, and my father had many Hindu friends, right? So he would play sports with them, limited in his business with them because, it's better to keep money within the Muslim community, but he did play sports, and he did have lots of Hindu customers. And so he didn't think twice, and he didn't think much of it for his friend's daughter to come and give me company. Of course, only girls were allowed into our house because, it would be not right for boys to enter. And so I was about 7, 8, maybe, I think. And I had other women living in the house with me at that time. So after my friend had left and she'd spent maybe a couple of hours, I was admonished, and I guess I got an earful of a lifetime, something that was quite pivotal for me, because what I was told and what I was reminded of, which were lessons that I was taught in madrasa as well, is that my friend who'd come over was fundamentally and inherently impure. Why? Because she was not of the book. To be of the book means to be of an Abrahamic tradition. So to be Christian, to be Jewish, or to be Muslim. She wasn't, she was Hindu. And, even worse than someone who is misguided from Islam, so the unrightly guided ones, so the Christians and the Jews, are the Hindus, because it's not unheard of in madrasa or in mosques to hear phrases like, they worship cows, they drink cow piss, they're idolatrators, they don't have one true God. And so at that age of 7 or so, not only did I have to hear this earful, not only was I, given the cold shoulder for several days for allowing that to happen. Let's forget that my father had invited her and said, it will keep my daughter busy for a couple of hours. The punishment rested on me, even before I was at the age of maturity, because I should know better. And so not only was I, admonished in that sense, but I also had to wash every single thing that she touched 3 times. I had to wash all the dishes. Anything that she'd eaten, I had to throw away. And I was constantly reminded for the next 3 days that my prayers would not be answered because I was now impure until the impurity had passed out of me. Now, you get to a point where that happens enough, and, rightly so, you just think, I can't be bothered anymore. It's not worth it. It's not worth having this punishment all the time. You'd still keep asking why, but it's not hard to extend that and see why actually, it's off-putting to go outside of what is deemed halal. If I may, I'll just go on to maybe where this idea stems from. So Islam is often regarded, or the rhetoric that we hear in the world is Islam is a religion of peace. And that's quite a powerful narrative that exists today, especially when we look at Islamophobia. So this is true. There are terms. So there is Darul Islam, where it is the realm of peace. But the mirror image to that is the realm of war, Darul Harb. So Darul Islam is where everyone is a Muslim. Yes, you might have the really pious Muslims, you'll have those that are maybe hypocritical but trying, but everyone in this world is a Muslim. And so you have a central law that can govern you. You have the mosques that can adjudicate and be the councils. You have every good citizen looking out for one another, and their peace can prevail. But then outside of this realm where everyone is Muslim, you have Darul Harb, and that is the realm where jihad must exist. Now that can be physical, as it was in the past, and there are some examples today too, but it can also be intellectual, it can be of the word, it can be mobilizing in different ways. And in this realm of war, where Darul Harb, this is where all the non-believers reside. This is where law does not prevail. And certain fatwas may be issued, so certain rulings may be issued, but also everyone that exists in this realm is misguided. And so it's really important for those in the realm of peace, I guess you can draw parallels to the kingdom of God here, to be able to guide those in the realm of war through any means necessary to the right path. Now, if someone resists or rejects, there is a punishment and there is a law for that. But conversion, celebrating those that convert into Islam is again a very powerful idea, because you've not only brought someone into the realm of peace, but also you've guaranteed your ticket to heaven. So given this construct, some of these attitudes and some of the behaviors that we see, the lack of integration sometimes, can be explained.
Thank you so much. I think the whole idea of this realm of peace and war, it just gives us a new understanding of that. And thank you for that. So I want to move on because I'm just conscious of time, and we could talk about this for, I wish we had another hour, but we don't. So let's move on to your journey away from Islam, and look at two areas that I'm particularly interested in: the journey itself and, of course, where you find yourself now. I think we hear in the media that Islam is one of the fastest growing religions, but what we don't often hear are the stories of those young people like you that question their faith and look for another path. And as many people listening tonight will know, apostasy in Islam is punishable by death. And although in this country like the UK, we have protections, but there are also those fears of repercussions that still exist among young people. And I think there's also those heart-wrenching stories that I've read about of depression, isolation from family, community, and even suicide. So I guess if you could take us through your journey, and maybe for the audience, talk through your fears and what precautions you had to take on that journey.
Sure. So I guess for me, it started quite young. Like I think I already mentioned that at the age of 11, my mother felt that it was really important to send me to Iran so that, I could learn the central ideas of Islam and that I would stop rebelling, I guess, or questioning. And I guess rebelling is her term, but questioning some of these important ideas that she felt that were necessary for me to be a good Muslim. So going to Iran was powerful. It, showed me a different world. However, I came back and I still found some of these powerful ideas, some of these powerful questions that were not open to me, that were not available to me, quite troubling. Why was I not allowed to ask the question that, how is it okay for Prophet Muhammad to have a wife at the age of 6? Why was I admonished for asking that? Why could I not step outside of Islam and look at Islam from the outside in? If it really was the true religion, the true way, it should become so apparent to me. More people would come. And so ideas like this, questions like this were really troubling for me, and I kept asking them. I remember at a young age, there were protests, I can't remember where in the world, against Salman Rushdie, because he'd written the satanic verses and there was a bit of a revival and people were burning books. And I remember asking my family and scholars alike, because I'd outgrown my madrasa teachers and I'd go and sit with the Maulanas to say, help me understand, why is it that something that is written is so troubling? If Islam is the true religion, surely we should be able to verify that. And so questions like that plagued me. They didn't leave me. And I guess I got to college where I started to study philosophy, and I found myself to be the only Muslim in the class. And for the first time, Nicola, I felt truly not alone, because for the first time I could ask questions and not be policed. I could ask questions and not have my parents hear about it. I could ask questions and not have shame brought upon me or feel that burden of bringing shame to my family. So a really powerful environment, where I was able to explore ideas such as the logical inconsistency of God. But also I had young people around me, my age, that would question, that would say, why is it that you do this? Why is it that you wear the hijab? Why is it that there are differences? And that for me was pivotal. And at the end of my first year of college, I think I'd come to this, really firm conclusion that I am atheist. I may wear the garb, I may present myself as a Muslim, I may go through the motions because I feared for myself, but I knew in my heart that I'd actually left Islam at the age of 17. Now, you talked about fears. So, from around the age of 5 or 6, even though there are protections in this country, it was not uncommon for me to hear things like, if you misbehave, if I see you out on the street with a young boy, or if you do anything that would bring shame upon the family, I will send you to another country. I will get you married off, or you won't be breathing anymore. These threats were not uncommon. And so it took me a long time, to pluck up the courage to try and find an escape route. At one point I thought, I'll go to university, I'll live for 3 years, I'll taste the world. And then, I love my parents. I'll get married, I'll settle down, and I'll say goodbye to my freedom. And there was only so long I could go accepting that before I guess my spirit started to die, before I started to harden myself. And so I made the decision to leave. I took precautions to move around for a couple of, every couple of days, every couple of weeks for a couple of years. I took measures, speaking to the police and so forth, to keep myself secure. But that is what I felt that I needed to do, even though I knew, I live in a modern developed country. The threats that had plagued me since a young age were quite powerful. Moving on, at the age of 18, 19, I started studying Greek and Hindu philosophy. And that's probably the next pivotal point for me.
Yeah, so I think that's what's really intrigued me about hearing about your journey, really, is because I'm fascinated by it, because I think there is such a difference, isn't there, between Islam and Hinduism. And I guess, what was it that drew you to those dharmic ideas rather than stopping at atheism, which many young Muslims do when they leave?
Absolutely. So arriving at atheism is quite simple, because you reject the notion of an Abrahamic God, which is, common to all Abrahamic traditions. However, when you grow up in Islam, because any non-Abrahamic idea is so over there, you naturally don't consider it, because you've been conditioned from a young age to see the world in a particular way. You do have to push your questioning. And I think that's what studying Hindu philosophy did for me. It was at this point where I was speaking to Hindus, and I was speaking to a teacher, actually the teacher that taught me Hindu philosophy. And I very proudly said, I'm atheist, I may be agnostic, I've rejected this notion that I've grown up with. And they turned around to me and said, okay, that's so you've rejected the notion of a personal God. And they introduced the notion of an impersonal God by sharing this example. And they said, if you could take an atom and if you break it down into its subatomic particles, keep going beyond quarks, keep going, keep going, keep going. Get to the point where, by any force, you cannot split it anymore. At that point, that indivisible point, could that be God? Can we redefine God to mean that? And that for me was so powerful because it opened up a whole new corridor of knowledge that I'd never even considered. It was right there, but I was blind to it. So that for me was really powerful, really pivotal. And, it just unleashed a whole new, direction of inquiry. So I went on studying philosophy, reading things like the Mahabharata. And what, really enchanted me was, here is a tradition, here is a culture that doesn't tell you what to do. It gives you questions. It shows you the gray. It doesn't give you black and white. It doesn't give you absolute. But instead, it forces you to think. It pushes you to think. And when you think you've arrived at a position, it will introduce a counter position to knock you off your feet. And, there is plurality in that. Someone can be a materialist. Someone can be an atheist. Someone can believe in some other force being God. They can believe in a personal God. They can believe in an impersonal God, and yet still be considered Hindu. And this plurality and this acceptance with spirituality, I have found not only to be incredibly inviting, incredibly well married with science, actually, and I studied chemistry, so it naturally appealed to me, but also this notion allows you to transcend the politics of religion. Now talking about one religion versus another feels like playground politics. You transcend it. And so what's really helped me is relinquishing the need for anger, relinquishing the need to hate. So when I speak to you today, I don't speak from a position to hate Islam. In fact, I speak from a position of sympathy to say, actually, there's so much going on that we do need to talk about. We do need to normalize the dialogue and the action around leaving Islam. And I think that's something that the Hindu community has taught me beautifully. It is something that, I've been really humbled to learn and still continue to learn.
I think that brings me nicely onto what I wanted to ask you about, was because, again, another thing that fascinates me about your story is how the Hindu community have sort of embraced you. Can you just tell us briefly about that?
Sure. I think, there's so much I could say, but then there's so much I shouldn't say. I think the biggest testament is the fact that, the very fact of where I sit now. For the last 9 years, I've been involved with the National Hindu Students Forum. And for the last 3.5, I've had the privilege and the blessing to be the national president. And I think that tells you everything that we need to know about the Hindu community. I've truly been embraced. I've been challenged. I've been questioned, and I've loved it. And, there is no need for me to feel the need to carry the label ex-Muslim. In fact, I can look back in my history and I can see, by speaking to, people who've studied this, but also going up my family tree, that 4 or 5 generations ago, my family were Hindu too. They were converted about 4 or 5 generations ago. And so, in fact, I'm rediscovering some of my lost heritage. So I think that is the biggest example I can give.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. I guess we are running very close to our time now, so there's just a couple more questions I would like to just throw your way, if you don't mind. I guess really, I would suggest that really to move to a more moderate version of Islam, we do need room to criticise and debate. However, I think, as we've discussed before, there does seem to be a bit of a current societal censor in the UK against open discussion. And I was wondering what you felt about whether this does hinder our fight for true equality. And in doing that, I think the final question, so I'll put these two together just so that you can, because it might give you a bit more context, is again, why you feel now is important to speak out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So over the last couple of years, I've been, really fortunate, like we said, to be part of NHSF and to interact with young people across the country. So, NHSF is active at just under half the universities in the UK. And every time I go to visit a university, every time we hold a committees day or have hundreds and thousands of students come together, I'm awestruck. I'm awestruck at the liberty that I see. the plurality that I see, but also the acceptance that I see, the acceptance of diversity, the acceptance of differences. And somehow there is a common thread that holds it all together, which I find so beautiful, so inspiring. Now, seeing that for a couple of years, yes, you can be inspired, but you cannot turn a blind gaze or a blind eye to my upbringing, to see what I've seen. And so in today's world, we talk about, quite rightly, we talk about racism. We talk about discrimination. We talk about equality and the need for women's rights. We talk quite passionately about it. But at the same time, we don't necessarily talk about the thousands and thousands of women around the world that are being stoned to death every day. The thousands of women around the world whose voices are silenced. Thousands of women who simply disappear. Now that's in the world out there. Here in the UK, you have psychological and often physical violence and trauma that persists every single day. And, I don't think it's anyone's fault in particular, but there are ideas that we should rightly challenge. There are ideas we should question and we should critique, because that is how we evolve and we progress. And so the need of the reason why I feel the need to speak, and the reason why I agreed to come onto this panel, after almost a decade of relative anonymity, is because I think this is important. Everywhere I look, we criticize ideas. The Hindu community, the white community, all sorts is criticized. But it comes to Islam, it comes to some of these relatively intolerant practices. It comes to how there is psychological trauma being perpetuated quite often by women against women, and we fall silent. We somehow accept that you get to the point of religion and thereafter you can ask no questions. And I think today that should not be the case, considering all the big narratives that we have that exist. And there is a need for a new narrative. There is a need to soften some of these practices, to question and to challenge some of these experiences. So why do we stop there? Why is it okay for us to say, we can't question this because it's to do with Islam, because religion has come in? So I've been lucky and I count my blessings every day, but there are thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of young girls, young people across the world that are not so lucky. And it is my hope that, through having this dialogue, through just starting this dialogue, that we can start to explore that. And it's, I have to say thank you to you. I have to say thank you to the entire Vichara Manthan team and Sustainable Narratives team for moving with earnestness and integrity to have this discussion when so many do not want to have this discussion.
Thank you so much. I mean, in terms of, there must be a lot of young people out there today, some of which will listen to this afterwards, young Muslims that are questioning it. We've only got really a minute before I close. What would you say to those young people now? If you had just a minute to tell them what they should do next. They're at that stage where they're starting to really, really question, and they're looking for what to do. What would you say to them?
Question, explore, and never stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you will all join me in thanking Drishti for sharing her story and expert insights into the Islamic world today. And finally, a big thank you to you, our audience. I hope, like me, this has left you with a desire to learn more and be courageous in our search for knowledge, to question, look beyond mainstream media, and to gain a better understanding of our world and its prevailing narratives. So please do follow us and comment on all the usual social media channels to keep the dialogue going. So, namaste to everybody. And coming up next at 6 p.m. is our VM on creating wealth sustainability, followed by another Fireside Conversation, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. I can't wait. Thank you and namaste.